As humans, we've glorified war for centuries, in film, literature, and epic poems, even in sculpture. If you live in a major city, chances are there's a memorial nearby commemorating soldiers long dead. And then there's our digital medium, and in video games as well, war is all around us.
We've stormed the beaches at Normandy, defended Earth from alien threats, we've launched nuclear weapons, fought the Crusades, and battled mythical foes. Like many of the best stories, the best games thrive on conflict. And as far as conflict goes, few can match the bombast and spectacle of all-out war. It lets us command armies, shoot digital guns, and more often than not, blow shit up, all in the name of a greater cause. But at what point does this become redundant? At what point do games use war not for storytelling, but merely as a backdrop for heroics and violence? At what point does this glorification of war get old?
If you're like me, you've heard this story dozens of times before. A squad takes on an army or a lone hero saves the day. And if you're like me, you can appreciate when a game deviates from this formula. But a game's not afraid to take a deeper look at war, the causes, realities, and consequences of it.
A few standout titles have done just that. And with Call of Duty returning to World War II later this year, and Battlefront 2's story being told from the Empire's perspective, it's worth looking back to figure out how we can move forward.
War and video games have coexisted for a while. It goes back to the arcade days with cabinets like Space Invaders or Missile Command, games that, despite their technical limitations, framed their simple gameplay mechanics with a surrounding conflict. Then came 1981, and with it, Castle Wolfenstein. We were dropped into a historical war, a pixelated representation of an actual time period. It would be the first of dozens of titles set during World War II. For a while, this was the norm. I can't tell you how many times I stormed Omaha Beach, defended the Russian front, or dropped into Holland to end the war before Christmas. I have relatives that fought in World War II, but these games never bothered me on a personal level. The era was modern enough to interest me, but far enough away to ignore its realities. I liked the rhythm of these games. I liked the way the weapons felt in my digital hands. But that all changed in 2007.
U.S. Marines stationed on high alert were given the order to invade the small...
Unlike previous Call of Duty games, Modern Warfare eschewed the World War II setting for that of a fictional conflict spanning Russia, Ukraine, and the Middle East. It tells a story about terrorism and nuclear weapons, combining the fears of the 21st century with those of the Cold War. But here's the thing about Modern Warfare. In 2007, for the first time, I was playing a shooter about a current conflict. Yes, the plot was fictional, but many of its missions drew clear inspiration from events unfolding in Iraq and Afghanistan. My brother was in Iraq at the time with the US Marines. I can't remember the exact moment, but at some point it dawned on me. Modern Warfare had taken real-world horror and transformed it into fun. Imagine if they had video games in 1944. Picture a 16-year-old sitting in front of his TV, controller in hand, invading France while his older brother huddled in a foxhole in Belgium. This isn't too far from what happened in 2009. Developer Atomic Games announced 6 Days in Fallujah, a historical game set in Iraq in 2004. Because of how recent the events were, the studio and publisher Konami drew ire from the public and raised questions about the ethics of such a project. It was subsequently canceled under the pressure and hasn't seen the light of day since.
Now, don't get me wrong, I love Call of Duty 4. In fact, I'm playing the remaster right now, and even in 2017, it's fantastic. But my experience all those years ago raised questions like, should games like this even be fun? Is it okay to make these experiences into trophies, leaderboards, and achievements? What do war games like this say about our society or our culture in general?
After playing this game for the first time in years, many of my questions still remain. As it turns out, I wasn't the only one with these questions. Matthew Thomas Paine, a professor at the University of Notre Dame, wrote a book about military video games titled Playing War. In it, he explores how military games such as Call of Duty, Battlefield, and Tom Clancy's Rainbow Six have transformed contemporary conflicts into games. How they portray military tactics, yes, but also how they perpetuate widespread political beliefs. Look back at the evolution of military shooters. In a vast majority of them, we're fighting Germany, Japan, or fascist Italy. As Paine clarifies in his book, these games give us the virtual chance to stand up to our historical enemies, to be the heroes delivering the final blow to the age-old villains. But in our post-9/11 world, things changed. More frequently, military shooters asked us to wage war against radical terrorists from places across the world. We watched CNN and saw footage from Fallujah and Ramadi, clips of fighters with RPGs and AK-47s. We turned on our consoles and saw the same thing. This highlights how games can reflect the culture of our time, for better or worse. Our collective hopes, anxieties, and fears. Whether they be through a realistic lens or one tinted with fiction, these are stories that millions of people consume and spend billions of dollars on each and every year. And this isn't consigned to military shooters. Sci-fi titles like Halo 2 and Gears of War express the same fears of foreign invasion, of the enemy coming to our doorstep. In Halo 2, the aliens have found Earth. In Gears of War, the locusts have emerged from beneath our feet. These games may not have the burden of realism on the backs of their stories, but in the end, they are telling very familiar stories. And of course, many of these games glorify the events at hand. It's hard to make a war game that doesn't inherently romanticize war. We play most games for fun, escapism, or a sense of accomplishment. The vast majority of shooters are, by nature, going to sensationalize their conflicts.
This is nothing new. Film has done this for decades, and literature for centuries. Once more into the breach, dear friends. Valiant stories of brothers in arms fighting the forces of evil with God on their side.
Authors such as Ernest Hemingway, Joseph Heller, and Kurt Vonnegut published anti-war novels that broke down the structure and themes of the works that came before them. The film world saw a similar change in the tide. The French director François Truffaut once said it was impossible to make anti-war movies. With all of their excitement and sense of adventure, they inevitably make war look fun. But then Oliver Stone made Platoon. Francis Ford Coppola made Apocalypse Now. They made movies about the horrors and realities of war and the personal toll it can take on the human psyche. And then we have video games. In a lot of ways, we are still stuck in the past. Games, at least most of them, are made to be fun. They're made with a clear set of rules that dictates how we function within their worlds and, in turn, within the wars they depict. And many shooters do a great job of creating fun. I enjoy the hell out of them. But when I look at other titles, I'm confident we've actually taken those first few steps into more meaningful war stories.
As Payne says in his book, games, more than any other medium, can pose that difficult question. When, if ever, is it okay to pull the trigger?
Few games embody that choice more than Spec Ops: The Line. At the end of the game, you realize your character has created an imaginary villain to justify the horrific things you did in the chaos of war. And by giving you the chance to kill the villain or spare him, the game is asking you whether you think those actions were righteous. But more than that, Spec Ops highlights the consequences of war, while most shooters actively ignore them. In one sequence, developer Jaeger actually makes you walk through an area you previously shelled with white phosphorus, only to discover that you killed dozens of civilians in the process. Spec Ops doesn't ignore the ripple effects of your violence. Neither does this war of mine. In fact, this 2014 game focuses entirely on the civilian side of things, as your group fights to outlast the siege of a fictional city. You upgrade your shelter, scavenge for supplies, and heal other survivors while the war outside rages on. The only way to win is to survive until a ceasefire is called. And as civilians, that decision is completely out of your hands. You're at the mercy of a conflict you can't control. And then there's The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. And despite the RPG's fantasy setting, this is very much a game about war. Not the battles and heroics, but the politics, confusion, and results of war. We speak to soldiers on both sides, each one of them believing they're absolutely in the right. We see a landscape covered in corpses. We fight creatures that feed on the guilt and despair of war. The Witcher 3 may not show us raging battles, but it does show us the bitter aftermath in a massive open world.
To be clear, I'm not saying every game needs to say something profound about war or the way games relate to it. I'm still going to play this year's Call of Duty, and I'm still enjoying Titanfall 2 and Battlefield 1.
But 2016 did see the release of numerous shooters, many of them depicting war in one way or another. This is a pervasive genre, and it shows no signs of slowing down. War and video games are cousins. I just don't think they have the healthiest relationship right now. That's why games such as Spec Ops and The Witcher 3 are so important. Like any form of art or entertainment, video games can reflect the anxieties and aspirations of our time. To act like these multi-billion-dollar properties don't play a part in our collective culture would be a disservice to the medium many of us love. To act like games don't affect our perspective on war would be to ignore their broader potential.
And with Battlefront 2 and the new Call of Duty releasing later this year, I think we need to keep asking those difficult questions. And I think we need to keep moving forward. Hey everyone, thanks so much for watching this week's episode of Reboot. Next week, Jake and I will be doing a Q&A about this episode, which focus more on war, and we'll also be teasing our next episode, episode 6. So in the meantime, get your YouTube comments in, tweet at Jake Dekker or me, Mike Mahardy, and we might feature you on our show. See you then.